What language shall I borrow? Was a phrase that kept popping into my head this week as I reflected on the Pentecost story. What language shall I borrow? And I couldn't figure out where I had heard the phrase, and so I Googled it, and I found that it comes, of course, from the Good Friday hymn, O Sacred Head Sore Wounded. What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? And then it's a phrase borrowed from that hymn for numerous books about language and articles about theological language. What language shall I borrow to express my faith? What language, what words can describe what I might want to say about God? The disciples at Pentecost found that they needed to borrow lots of languages. Their own language was not enough. They needed more. In the late 90s, we lived in Ottawa in Canada, and we learned a lot there about the politics of language. The politics of Quebec and the struggle to maintain Quebec identity and the dominant English culture was always a passionate subject. In Ottawa, the politics of language ruled supreme. All our friends who were public servants had to be proficient in French to a certain level in order to be promoted. And so they seemed to be always going off for 3-month-long French immersion courses paid for by the taxpayer. They never seemed to be at their desks. And in any public events, French and English, of course, was always spoken and not translated. On our first summer holiday, we travelled up to northern Quebec to a beautiful place called the Lac Saint-Jean. And we didn't hear a word of English spoken all week. We went to a nearby town one rainy day to do some shopping, and our girls were little then, and I was looking for clothes for them, and there was a very helpful shop assistant helping me as we conversed in French. And then I turned in English and said to the girls, go and try those things on in the changing room. And the shop assistant turned and walked away and didn't speak another word to me. And I thought when I went to purchase something, she was actually going to refuse to serve me. To speak English was to belong to the English oppressor who wouldn't give Quebec independence. And interestingly, in the Anglican Church of Canada, there is not a word of French in their prayer book, and there's no translation of their prayer book into French either. When their new prayer book came out in the 90s, to have translated it into French would have been a sign of supporting Quebec independence. It took me a long time to figure that out. But instead, they do have a French prayer book, but it's the American one, because the Americans have done the translation. Language is a core part of our identity. In Aotearoa, we've learned just in time that speaking te reo is foundational to who we are as a nation. And in our church, we always use te reo to remind us who we are. We were a Maori church long before we were a settler church. Biculturalism and being a people of 2 languages is who we are. Now, the disciples, we are told, could communicate with the multicultural, multilingual crowds of Jerusalem. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of unpronounceable places like Phrygia and Pamphylia. Now, we don't really understand the ability of the disciples to speak these languages at Pentecost as a literal event. I think it rather describes the remarkable job the disciples did in the early days of the church about sharing the gospel and spreading the faith. So passionate were they about being followers of the way that they overcame all barriers of communication and culture and enthused others with their faith and their energy. And the Pentecost event is also a reversal of the Tower of Babel myth in Genesis chapter 11, where God scatters the people who until then had had one common language. God scatters them and gives them different languages because they had tried to build a tower all the way to heaven. And God thought that was just a little bit too much and he would fix them. And so they are scattered and given different languages. So the Pentecost story brings everybody back together again and being able to communicate. In the Pentecost account, Peter goes on to quote the prophet Joel to describe what will happen after Pentecost and after the Tower of Babel has been reversed. Peter says old women and men and young women and men and slaves and free, they will all see visions and they will all dream dreams. They will dream of a better world and a new way of being in relationship with each other. A world where God's presence is felt in a tangible way, where the Spirit appears as wind and fire. A world where God is present with the people and not sitting in the heavens looking down upon them. So what language do we use as bearers of our faith? Do we need to borrow someone else's language, or is our own language sufficient? Much of the language of our church and liturgy is ancient. Pentecost, Eucharist, acolyte, baptism, they're all ancient words from another culture and another language, and yet they've become ours over time. Because we are people of the Bible, we are people of stories and images. We are people of the prayer book, its language, its structure, its rhythms, its prayers. If I say, Christ is risen, you know that you're supposed to say, he is risen indeed. If I say, the peace of Christ be with you, you know to say, and also with you. Our liturgical and biblical language forms us as worshippers and believers. And language is something that we are very careful about at St. Matthew's. We always make sure we use a variety of names for God, and we use language that is inclusive of all people. We avoid hierarchical terms like Lord, and we emphasize the gathering of the people around the table to be nourished. And our worship is not only about our words, but also our body language and our actions. We embody our worship as we stand and sit and kneel and process and bow, as we make the sign of the cross. We embody our worship in our eating and drinking and shaking hands at the peace, and today being censed with the smoke of incense. And there's one thing that's been puzzling me since my arrival at St. Matthew's a few weeks ago, and that is while we are very careful about removing the hierarchy from our language, we still ask you, the congregation, to sit in rows like an audience with the expert people up here. The preacher still preaches from on high, and we move up to the high altar for communion, leaving behind the table around which we have gathered, and quite a number of the congregation who can't manage the stairs. It seems to me there's a dissonance here between the language of our gathering and the actions of our gathering. And I think that's something that we're going to be able to usefully explore and think about together. Barbara Brown Taylor, one of my favourite American writers and preachers, says, "Worship is how the people of God practice their reliance on God. We practice the patterns of our life together before God, rehearsing them until they become second nature to us. In our worship, from the opening acclamation to the dismissal, every element of the service has something to teach us about our life with God and one another. Practicing them over and over again, we build up the muscles of our hearts, our souls, and our minds, exercising our ability to respond to the presence of the holy in our midst. Exercising our ability to respond to the presence of the holy in our midst. So we build up our muscles in the words that we say and sing, and in the way we gather and move, and in our posture for worship. And we're training those muscles not for worship on its own, but for the rest of our lives, in our families, in our jobs, and our communities. Here in our worship, we practice compassion and justice, reflection, listening, receiving and offering, gathering, praying, serving, so that on Monday we can be compassionate, work for justice, listen and receive and offer and gather and pray and serve in our workplaces and in our homes and with our neighbours. The disciples were given new languages not for their own faith formation, but for the communicating of faith to others. The purpose of Pentecost was not an inward thing to build up the core of believers, but to share the good news of the gospel with those around them. And so today's Pentecost is you and me in our workplaces and our schools and our families and our community groups. So what language will we borrow on this day of Pentecost, this day of many languages? We don't need to borrow another's language. We need instead to rediscover our own, to reclaim our own faith and its words and its actions, because our own life with the Holy Spirit is quite sufficient. Pentecost is about moving outwards, sharing ourselves with others, offering the peace of Christ in the midst of all that we do. Peace, pe, rangimarie, are the words and actions that the world needs. And it is in order to proclaim that essential Pentecostal truth, to be part of the miracle of communication and understanding, and to share the peace which the world cannot give, that the Spirit sends us out to do today.